You're listening to Echoes of Trust and Betrayals, where betrayal has a voice and the truth always comes back loud. Before we begin tonight's journey into the heart of a setup, I want you to do something for me. Go to the comments right now. Tell me where you're listening from. Are you in the humid heat of Lagos, the busy streets of New York, the quiet suburbs of London, or the hills of Johannesburg? We are a global community of truth seekers, and your presence here matters. And answer this. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized they weren't your sanctuary? They were your predator. If so, this story is for you. I still remember the sound. It wasn't the scream I expected. It wasn't the deafening crack of the handgun, though that still rings in my ears every time the house gets too quiet. It wasn't even the sirens that came later, their red and blue lights painting the rain-slicked walls in a mockery of a celebration. No, the sound that haunts me is the simple metallic click of a key turning in a lock I had promised myself I'd never touch again. Because the moment I stepped back into that house, I didn't just walk into a building made of wood and secrets. I walked into my own destruction. I walked into the mouth of the beast that had swallowed my life whole. And the most terrifying part of it all, I did it on purpose. I did it because sometimes the only way to survive a trap is to walk right back into the center of it. My name is Ginny Morris. When people see me now, they see a woman who moves with a certain stillness. They see someone who doesn't flinch when a door slams or when a car backfires. They think I've always been this strong, this untouchable. They don't see the ghost of the woman I used to be. They don't see the woman who spent 3 months sleeping in the back of a sedan with a tire iron under her pillow, jumping at the vibration of every text message, terrified that a private number would appear, and a voice would say, "Ginny, we found you." They don't see the internal scars from being framed for a crime I didn't commit by the people I would have died for. Tonight, I am taking you back to the very beginning, to the day the architecture of my ruin was first designed. This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about the version of myself that almost didn't survive, and the woman who had to be born in the fire of betrayal to take her name back. Take a deep breath. The rain is starting to fall, and the house on the edge of town is waiting. To understand how I ended up in that interrogation room, you have to understand the silence that came before it. Not the peaceful silence of a house at rest, but the heavy, pressurized silence of a trap being set. My life before Robert had been a series of small, frantic movements, trying to stay ahead of bills, trying to outrun a childhood that felt like a shadow I couldn't shake. I was a woman who lived in the margins, the kind of person people look past in the grocery store. I was a ghost in my own life, and Robert was the first person who looked at me as if I were solid. I remember the night I moved into the house on the edge of town. It was an old Victorian, a grand, decaying lady of a building, with a wide porch and oaks so tall they seemed to scrape the stars. Robert called it our fresh start. He stood in the foyer, his hand on the small of my back, a gesture that felt like protection then, but feels like a claim now. The house smelled of lemon wax and old secrets. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty that felt staged. The windows in the back were painted shut, for insulation, he said. The locks on the doors were heavy, industrial-grade steel. I told myself I was lucky. I told myself that a man who locks the world out must really want to keep you in. I didn't realize that a sanctuary and a cell look exactly the same if you're looking at them from the inside. The first week was a dream. Robert was attentive in a way that felt like a warm bath. He'd leave notes on the kitchen counter. "You are my world. I finally found you." To a woman who had spent 30 years being told she was a burden, those notes were oxygen. I breathed them in until I was lightheaded. But there was a silent alarm ringing somewhere deep in my gut, a frequency I was choosing to ignore. It was the way Robert would watch me when I didn't know he was looking. Not with love, but with a clinical, detached calculation, like a man watching a clock, waiting for the hour to strike. I started noticing the visitors first, men who didn't look like family friends, arriving in the middle of the night, their cars parked far down the gravel driveway. Robert would disappear into the study for hours, the low rumble of their voices vibrating through the floorboards. When I'd ask him who they were, he'd just smile and tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "Business, Ginny, just boring business. I'm doing this all for us." That was his favorite phrase, "for us." He used it like a shield, a way to keep me from asking the questions that would eventually destroy me. Then came the physical isolation. It was subtle at first, a suggestion that I quit my job at the diner because the hours were too long, a comment about how my few friends were bad influences. Slowly, the world outside the Victorian house began to fade. The four walls became my entire universe. I spent my days polishing the silver and tending to a garden that the oaks wouldn't let the sun touch. I was becoming the perfect, quiet, invisible woman Robert wanted. I was being pruned like a rosebush until there was nothing left but the parts he found useful. I didn't know that the final part of his plan required me to be more than just a housewife. It required me to be a criminal. And as the rain began to fall on that first Tuesday in the house, I realized the silent alarm wasn't just in my head anymore. It was the house itself, screaming at me to run before the doors were locked for good. If Robert was the architect of my isolation, Lorraine was the interior decorator of my despair. She didn't arrive with a knock. She arrived with a key. I remember the first time I saw her. I was in the kitchen, trying to make the house smell like a home, the scent of cinnamon and apples fighting against the persistent mustiness of the old wood. I heard the front door click open, not the heavy, familiar thud in Robert's boots, but the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of expensive heels on the hardwood. I froze, a paring knife still in my hand, as a woman walked into my kitchen as if she was the one who had picked out the tiles. Lorraine was a woman made of sharp angles and curated silences. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful, and her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, didn't look at me so much as they appraised me. She sat down at the small circular table, pulling out the third chair, the one I usually kept pushed in, the one that felt like a placeholder for a guest who would never come. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask who I was. She just folded her hands, her manicured nails clicking against each other, and stared at the way I was holding the knife. "You must be Ginny," she said. Her voice was like crushed velvet, soft but with a grit underneath that could draw blood. "Robert told me you were manageable." I didn't know what to say. I felt like a trespasser in my own life. I offered her tea, my voice shaking just enough for her to notice, and she accepted with a nod that felt like a royal decree. As the kettle began to whistle, a shrill, panicked sound that matched my internal state, she began to move through the house. She didn't ask for a tour, she just walked. She touched the curtains I had chosen. She ran a finger over the dust on the mantel. She moved a photograph of me and Robert 2 inches to the left, as if correcting a mistake I didn't know I'd made. When Robert came home that evening, the air in the house shifted. It became electric, charged with a tension I couldn't name. He didn't seem surprised to see her. In fact, he looked relieved. They sat in the living room, their voices a low conspiratorial murmur, while I stay in the kitchen, a ghost hovering over a stove. I realized then that Lorraine wasn't just a family friend. She was the shadow cabinet of Robert's life. She was the one who vetted his choices, and apparently, I was the latest choice on her desk. I watched them through the doorway. They looked like a pair of scientists observing a specimen in a jar. Every time I tried to join the conversation, Lorraine would steer it toward my fragility. "Robert tells me you've been feeling overwhelmed, Ginny," she'd say, her eyes never leaving mine. "The transition to a house this size, it can be a lot for someone with your background." She said the word background like it was a contagious disease. She started showing up every day. She'd bring gifts, books on meditation, supplements for nervous exhaustion, articles about women who had lost their way. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of my confidence. She was planting seeds of doubt in the soil of my mind, and Robert was the one watering them. By the end of the second month, I was starting to believe her. I was starting to think that maybe I was imagining the men in the night. Maybe the locks on the doors were for my own safety because I couldn't be trusted to stay grounded. Lorraine had occupied the third chair in my life so completely that there was no room left for me to sit. I was being squeezed out of my own existence, replaced by a version of myself that was unstable, jealous, and difficult. I didn't realize that they weren't trying to heal me. They were building a profile. They were creating the Ginny Morris that the jury would eventually see, the woman who snapped because she couldn't handle the weight of a life she never deserved. And as Lorraine sipped her tea, watching me with that pale, frozen smile, I realized the third chair wasn't for a guest. It was for the executioner. By the third month, the house felt like it was breathing with me. Or perhaps it was breathing for me. Every time I tried to open a window, the wood seemed to swell, resisting my touch. Every time I reached for the phone, the silence on the other end felt heavier, as if the wires themselves were being choked by the ivy outside. I was a ghost in a silk robe, wandering through rooms that Lorraine had reorganized until they felt like a museum of someone else's life. But then, the hammering started. Robert had decided the back porch was rotting. He said it was a safety hazard, another reason I shouldn't go outside without him. He hired a man named Steve Reynolds to fix it. Steve didn't look like the men who visited Robert in the middle of the night. He didn't wear a suit that hid a weapon, and he didn't drive a car with tinted windows. He drove a battered blue pickup truck that smelled of sawdust and old coffee. He was a man made of leather and grit, with eyes that looked like they had seen the horizon and didn't care for what was on the other side. I started bringing him water. At first, it was just an excuse to feel the sun on my skin for 5 minutes without Lorraine's pale eyes tracking my movement from the kitchen window. Steve would take the glass with a nod, his calloused fingers brushing against mine. He didn't talk much, but he watched. He watched the way I jumped when a car backfired down the road. He watched the way I looked at the heavy industrial locks on the back door. He watched the way Robert spoke to me, that soft, condescending tone that sounded like a lullaby but felt like a leash. "You ever wonder why the birds don't nest in these trees, Ginny?" he asked one afternoon. It was a strange question. I looked up at the ancient oaks, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers, blotting out the light. I'd never noticed, but he was right. The woods were silent. No chirping, no fluttering, just the wind whistling through the dry leaves. "They know when a place is holding its breath," Steve said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They don't like to stay where the air is stagnant." I tried to laugh it off, to tell him he was being poetic, but he didn't smile. He leaned against the porch railing, looking at me with a pity that made my stomach turn. He told me about the woman who lived here before me, a woman named Sarah. He said she used to sit on the porch just like I did, looking at the road as if she were waiting for a bus that never came. And then, one day, she was gone. Robert told everyone she'd moved to the city to be with family, but Steve Steve had seen Robert and Lorraine carrying boxes out of the house in the middle of the night 3 weeks after she left. "Lorraine is the brain and Robert is the fist," Steve whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the cedar on his shirt. "They don't pick women like you by accident, Ginny. They pick women who have nowhere else to go, women whose disappearance won't make a sound." My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird rhythm. I wanted to scream at him that he was wrong, that Robert loved me, that Lorraine was just complicated. But the words died in my throat, because I remembered the folder Lorraine had shown me. I remembered the way she knew my mother's medical history better than I did. That night, I made the fatal mistake of testing the waters. I mentioned Steve's name to Robert over dinner. I watched the transformation. It wasn't an explosion, it was a freeze. Robert set his fork down with a slow, deliberate precision. His face didn't redden, it went pale, a terrifying waxen mask of calm. He didn't ask what Steve said. He just looked at me, his eyes 2 black pits of calculation. "Steve Reynolds is a bitter man, Ginny. He has a history of hallucinations. It's why he works alone." The next morning, Steve was gone. His tools were missing, and the porch was left half-finished, the raw wood exposed to the elements like an open wound. When I asked Robert where he was, he didn't look up from his newspaper. "He was making you uncomfortable, Ginny. I could see it. I let him go for your own good." But the "for your own good" felt like a door locking. Lorraine arrived an hour later, her smile wider and sharper than usual. She brought me a new set of supplements, pills that made the world feel blurry and slow. "We have to protect you, Ginny," she cooed, stroking my hair with her cold, manicured fingers. "The world is so full of people who want to tell you lies." I sat on the half-finished porch, looking at the empty driveway, and realized the profit was gone. The only thing left was the stagnant air and the silent trees. And for the first time, I realized that I wasn't just a housewife. I was a witness, being prepared for a trial I didn't know was coming. Thursday was always the day the house felt the heaviest. It was the day the business visitors stayed the longest, and the day Lorraine's perfume seemed to linger in the hallways like a physical presence. But this Thursday was different. The air didn't just feel heavy, it felt electrified, like the moments before a lightning strike. Robert had left early, his face a granite mask of preoccupation. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He didn't even look at me. He just checked the lock on the front door twice and disappeared into the gray mist of the morning. I was in the kitchen, staring at the half-finished porch through the window, when Lorraine appeared. She didn't use the front door. She came through the garage, her trench coat slick with rain, looking like a soldier returning from a front line I wasn't allowed to see. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't offer a polite greeting. She walked straight to the dining table and dropped a heavy leather-bound folder onto the wood. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. "Sit down, Ginny," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a command that pulled the air right out of my lungs. I sat. My hands felt like lead weights in my lap. She opened the folder, and my life spilled out across the table. There were my medical records from the year my mother died. There were credit reports from a decade ago, highlighting debts I'd worked 3 jobs to pay off. There was a police report from a night I'd tried to forget, a night I'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time in my early 20s. She had mapped the geography of my failures with the precision of a surgeon. "Robert is in trouble, Ginny," she whispered, leaning over the table until I could see the tiny, cold cracks in her pale blue eyes. "People want to ruin him. They want to take this house, and they want to take the life he's built for you. Do you want to go back to the margins? Do you want to go back to sleeping in your car?" I shook my head, my throat so tight I couldn't swallow. She reached out and stroked my hand, her fingers like ice. "Then tonight, you're going to prove your loyalty. You're going to be the anchor that keeps him steady." She handed me a small silver key. Robert is going to bring a guest home tonight, a man who wants to hurt him. You are going to go to the study. You are going to open the bottom drawer of the desk. You'll find an envelope and a tool. When Robert calls for you, you bring them down. No questions, no hesitation. If you do this, the folder disappears. If you don't, well, I think the police would be very interested in your unstable history. The rest of the day was a blur of nausea and shadows. I moved through the house like a puppet with frayed strings. I went to the study. I opened the drawer. Inside was a thick envelope of cash, more money than I had ever seen in my life, and a handgun. It was cold, heavy, and smelled of oil and finality. I stared at it for a long time, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I realized then that I wasn't being asked to help. I was being framed. Every step I took was being recorded by the silent alarm Steve had warned me about. Night fell like a shroud. The front door opened and the air in the house turned frigid. Robert was there, but he wasn't alone. He was leading a man into the living room, a man who looked terrified, his eyes darting toward the shadows. I heard Robert's voice, that soft, deadly purr. "Ginny, bring it down, sweetheart." My legs moved before my brain could scream. I walked down the stairs, the gun and the cash heavy in my arms. I saw Lorraine standing in the corner, her face a mask of absolute, terrifying expectation. The man looked at me, his mouth opening to speak, but the words were cut short by the flash of a second weapon in Robert's hand. The man dropped like his bones had turned to water. I didn't scream. My voice had died in my throat. I stood there frozen as Robert stepped over the body and took the gun from my hands with a silk handkerchief. He pressed my fingers onto the warm, smoking barrel, his eyes locked on mine with a look of pure, clinical triumph. "Thank you, Ginny," he whispered. "You really are perfect." Lorraine stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood next to the growing pool of red. "The sirens will be here in 3 minutes," she said, checking her watch. "Make sure you look properly unstable for the officers, Ginny. It's the role you were born to play." The man on the floor didn't look like a threat anymore. He looked like a discarded coat, tangled and still. The smell of ozone and copper filled the room, thick enough to taste. I stood there, my hands still curled in the shape of the weapon Robert had just pried from my fingers. My skin felt electric, buzzing with a heat that wasn't mine. I looked at Robert, expecting to see horror, expecting him to grab me and tell me we had to run. But he was just dusting his sleeves. "You did well, Ginny," he whispered. His voice was a caress that made my skin crawl. He took the handkerchief, the one he'd used to press my prints onto the warm metal, and tucked it neatly into his pocket. He looked at Lorraine. She didn't look at the body. She was looking at the front door, her head tilted like a bird listening for a worm. Then I heard it. A faint wailing cry in the distance. It started as a pinprick of sound, growing louder, sharper, cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The sirens. "Now," Lorraine said, her voice snapping like a whip. She grabbed my shoulders, her nails digging through my sweater into my skin. "You snapped. You found out about the money. You thought he was a lover. You thought Robert was cheating. It doesn't matter. You were jealous. You were unstable. You've been unwell for months, Ginny. Everyone knows it. We've told everyone." She shook me, her eyes boring into mine with a predatory intensity. "If you say anything else, if you mention the folder, if you mention the basement, Robert goes to jail and you go to the ground. Do you understand?" I couldn't breathe. The air in the house had turned to lead. Robert moved to the window, his face suddenly contorting into a mask of grief so convincing it made me sick. He started shouting, his voice cracking with a fake, high-pitched terror. "Ginny, no! Why did you do it? Put it down!" But the gun was already on the floor. He was performing for the microphones he knew were coming. He was painting the scene before the paint was even dry. "Police! Hands up!" The room was suddenly flooded with white light, blinding and harsh. I felt myself being shoved to the floor, the cold hardwood pressing against my cheek. I saw the black boots of the officers, heard the frantic shouting, the metallic clink of handcuffs being readied. I looked up, and through the forest of legs, I saw them. Robert was on his knees, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lorraine was standing behind him, her hand on his back, looking at the officers with a face full of tragic, weary disappointment. She just snapped," I heard Lorraine tell an officer, her voice trembling perfectly. "We tried to help her. We tried to get her treatment. She's been so volatile lately." Every word was a brick in my prison wall. Every sob from Robert was a nail in my coffin. I tried to speak, to tell them about the folder, to tell them about the man stumbling in, but my voice was a broken, useless thing. All that came out was a jagged, terrified gasp. They dragged me out into the rain. The red and blue lights turned the world into a flickering nightmare, a strobe light of my own destruction. I saw the neighbors standing on their porches, their faces illuminated by the glow of the cruisers. I saw the pity, the fear, the judgment. I was the crazy woman from the big house. I was the unstable girlfriend. I looked at the Victorian house as they pushed me into the back of the car, and for a split second, the porch light flickered. I saw Lorraine standing there, watching the car pull away. She wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling, a tiny, cold sliver of a smile that said, "Game over." As the car pulled out of the driveway, the silent alarm in my head finally stopped ringing. It was replaced by the cold, heavy realization that I wasn't just going to jail. I was being erased. Interrogation is not about the truth. It is about the reflection of the truth they want you to see. They put me in a room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade bleach, a room with no windows, just a single buzzing fluorescent light that flickered at a frequency that made my eyes ache. I sat there for hours, my wrists raw from the handcuffs, my head spinning from the supplements Lorraine had been feeding me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man on the floor. Every time I opened them, I saw the detective. Detective Miller didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had seen too many bodies and believed in too many lies. He sat across from me, his face a map of deep-set exhaustion. He didn't yell, he didn't slam the table. He just slid a stack of photographs toward me, one by one, like a dealer at a casino where the stakes were my life. "You've been through a lot, Ginny," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "Robert told us everything, how he tried to help you, how he brought Lorraine in to keep an eye on you because he was worried you might do something to yourself. He's devastated, you know. He really thought he could save you." I looked at the photos. I saw my own prints on the gun. I saw the thick envelope of cash, the motive they'd crafted for me. They said I'd found the money and tried to steal it. They said when the courier arrived to collect it, I'd snapped. "I didn't do it," I whispered. My voice sounded thin, alien, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "He gave me the gun. She gave me the folder. They set me up." Miller leaned forward, the fluorescent light reflecting in his eyes. "The folder? What folder, Ginny? We searched the house. We found your medical records, the ones showing your history of dissociative episodes. But there was no secret folder, no evidence of a setup, just a man who loved you and a woman who tried to be your friend." That was the moment the box of mirrors finally closed around me. Lorraine hadn't just taken the folder, she had erased it. She had spent months building a paper trail of my instability while keeping the evidence of her own crimes invisible. I realized then that everyone I spoke to, the neighbors, the police, the doctors, they were all seeing the Ginny that Lorraine had painted. I was screaming from behind a glass wall, and all they saw was a woman moving her mouth in a silent, crazy dance. "Is sup," closed quotes. "Robert says you've been forgetting things lately," Miller continued, his voice dropping into a tone of forced empathy. "He says you have these blackouts. Is it possible, Ginny? Is it possible you don't remember pulling the trigger? It happens sometimes. The mind tries to protect itself from the things the hands have done." I stared at him, my heart hammering a frantic, trapped bird rhythm. I started to doubt my own eyes. Had the man really stumbled in? Had Robert really fired? Or was the silent alarm in my head actually the sound of my own mind breaking? They kept me in that room until the walls started to bleed into the floor. They brought in a psychiatrist who talked to me in the same soft, condescending tone Lorraine used. They told me that if I confessed, they could get me help instead of a cell. They showed me a video of Robert sitting in the waiting room, his head in his hands, looking like a man who had lost his soul. I realized then that I was a ghost. I had no family to call, no friends to vouch for me. I was a blank slate, and they had written a murder story on me in permanent ink. But as the detective stood up to leave, he said one thing that sparked a tiny, cold flame in the dark. "Strange thing, though, Steve Reynolds, that handyman, he called the station, said he saw something. But he's a known drunk, Ginny. We don't put much stock in what people like that say." Miller walked out, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound that felt like a coffin lid. I sat in the silence, the flickering light buzzing in my ears, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Steve was alive. Steve knew. The mirrors were starting to crack, and through the slivers, I could see a way back into the house. I wasn't going to confess. I was going to wait. Because a trap only works as long as the animal inside stays scared, and I was starting to get very, very angry. 3 days, 72 hours of fluorescent lights and the smell of floor wax. I had stopped crying. Crying was a luxury for people who still had a home to go back to. I had become a statue, sitting on the edge of a thin plastic cot, watching the dust motes dance in the sterile air. I was waiting for a public defender with tired eyes and a briefcase full of plea deals. I was waiting for the final gavel to fall. But then, a guard with a face like a bulldog tapped on my cell bars. "Morris, you've got a visitor." I expected Robert. I expected him to come with a rehearsed look of heartbreak, to lean against the glass and tell me he'd do his best to get me a light sentence if I just kept quiet. I expected Lorraine coming to gloat behind a veil of false concern. But when I walked into the visiting room, the man sitting behind the scratched plexiglass wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a look of grim, unshakable purpose. It was Steve Reynolds. He looked out of place in the sterile, high-contrast world of the precinct. He looked like a piece of the earth that had been dragged indoors. He didn't pick up the phone right away. He just looked at me, really looked at me, searching my face for the woman he'd seen on the porch. I picked up the receiver, my hand trembling so hard it hit the glass with a dull thud. "Steve?" I whispered. "You shouldn't be here. Robert, they said you were a drunk. They said you didn't see anything." "They say a lot of things in that house, Ginny," Steve said. His voice was a lifeline, a rough, honest sound that cut through the layers of gaslighting. I was there that night. I wasn't at the bar. I was working late on the neighbor's fence down the street. I saw the car pull up. I saw Lorraine go in, looking like she was going to war. And I saw Robert pacing that living room like a wolf in a cage. My breath hitched. I leaned against the glass, my forehead cool against the plastic. "Did you see the man? The one who died?" Steve leaned closer, his voice dropping into a register that the guards couldn't hear. "I saw a man stumble in. I saw the flash in the window. And then, Ginny, I saw Lorraine walk out the back door 5 minutes later, calm as a Sunday morning, carrying a small black box under her arm. She didn't look like a woman who'd just witnessed a tragedy. She looked like a woman who'd just finished a transaction. Hope, a small, fragile, terrifying thing, flared in my chest. "You told the police? You told Miller?" Steve's eyes darkened. "I tried, but Miller is cousins with the man who manages the powerful man's construction contracts. And Lorraine has been donating to the Police Athletic League for 10 years. They laughed me out of the lobby." I felt the hope shatter, the shards cutting into my throat. "So, that's it? I'm going to prison because they've bought the very air we breathe?" Steve shook his head, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the room feel small. "No, because they missed something. Robert is arrogant, Ginny. He thinks he's the smartest man in the room, but he's just the loudest. That house? It has an old security system, not the digital ones the police checked, an old hard-wired DVR system hidden in the study. I saw the wires when I was fixing the porch. It's still there, behind the painting of the mountain. If we can get that box, we get the truth. We get the truth. But I can't get in there, Ginny. They've got the place locked down like a fortress. The only person they'll let through that door is you." I stared at him, horrified. "They let me out on a technical bond this morning, Steve. They think I'm going to run. If I go back there, they'll kill me." Steve nodded, a slow, grim acknowledgement. "They might. But if you don't go back, the lie becomes the truth forever. You have to walk back into the house that destroyed you, Ginny. You have to be the ghost they aren't expecting." The guard stepped forward, his hand on my shoulder. Steve stood up, his hand pressing against the glass, mirroring where mine had been. "I'll be outside, in the blue truck, at midnight. Don't be the woman they think you are, Ginny. Be the woman who survived." As they led me back to the cell, the silent alarm in my head started a new rhythm. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a countdown. Midnight was coming, and I was going home to collect a debt. They released me at 10 p.m. No fanfare, no apology, just a signature on a piece of paper that felt like a death warrant, and the cold weight of my personal belongings in a plastic bag. I stood on the sidewalk outside the precinct, the humid night air clinging to my skin like a shroud. I looked at the streetlights, their yellow glow smeared by the mist, and for a second I wanted to run. I wanted to walk until the city lights disappeared, until I was just a nameless shadow on a Greyhound bus headed for a state where no one knew the name Ginny Morris. But then I saw the blue pickup truck. It was parked in the shadows of a closed warehouse, its headlights off, its silhouette as steady as a mountain. Steve was behind the wheel. He didn't say a word as I climbed into the passenger seat. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just handed me a small, cheap burner phone and a heavy metal flashlight. "No tracking on this," he said. "If you get stuck, hit the 1 key. I'll be at the tree line by the back porch." I gripped the flashlight, its cold casing the only solid thing in a world made of smoke and mirrors. The drive to the edge of town felt like a descent into a dream I couldn't wake up from. The Victorian house sat back from the road, its windows dark, its wide porch looking like a row of teeth waiting to snap shut. Robert and Lorraine were inside. I knew they were. They were probably in the kitchen, drinking the expensive wine they'd bought with the transaction money, laughing about the unstable woman they'd successfully discarded. I stepped out of the truck, the damp grass soaking my sneakers instantly. I didn't go to the front door. I went to the back, to the half-finished porch, where the raw wood still smelled of cedar and betrayal. The back door creaked as I touched the handle. It wasn't locked. Why would it be? They thought I was a broken bird with clipped wings, shivering in a shelter or hiding in a basement. I stepped into the kitchen. The air smelled of wood polish and Lorraine's jasmine perfume, a scent that now made my stomach heave. I moved like a shadow, my back against the wall, my breathing so shallow I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Every floorboard was a landmine. Every shadow was a ghost. I reached the study. The door was heavy oak, and it resisted me as if the house itself were trying to protect its master. I slipped inside, the moonlight through the painted-shut windows casting long, distorted bars across the carpet. I didn't turn on the light. I moved toward the wall, toward the painting of the mountain, the one Robert always said reminded him of his ambitions. I reached behind the frame, my fingers brushing against the cold, rough wires Steve had described. My heart was hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm. I found the panel. It was a small, recessed box hidden behind a flap of drywall. Inside was the DVR, a black metallic heart that had recorded every heartbeat of the crime. I started to pull at the cables, my fingers fumbling with the plastic clips. 1, 2. They wouldn't budge. I felt the sweat prickling at my hairline. I reached for the third cable, and that's when I heard it. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Not the house settling, not the wind, the rhythmic, heavy tread of someone who knew exactly where they were going. I froze, my hand still gripped on the black box. The study door creaked open, a sliver of light from the hallway cutting across the floor like a blade. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. The scent of jasmine filled the room, cloying and suffocating. "You always were a slow learner, Ginny," a voice whispered. It was Lorraine. She wasn't wearing her trench coat. She was wearing a silk robe, a fireplace poker gripped in her hand, and a smile that looked like a scar in the moonlight. "We were just talking about you, weren't we, Robert?" Robert stepped into the sliver of light. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a father who had caught a child stealing from a cookie jar. "I really wanted you to just disappear, Ginny," he said, his voice a soft, deadly purr. "I really did, but you just couldn't stay away from the ghosts, could you?" I clutched the DVR to my chest, the metal edges digging into my skin. I wasn't the woman they thought I was. I wasn't the unstable girl anymore. I looked at them, the architect and the decorator, and I felt a cold, sharp peace. "I'm not a ghost yet, Robert," I said, my voice steady for the first time in months. "But this house is about to be very, very crowded." The study felt smaller than it ever had before. The high ceilings, once elegant, now felt like the top of a well I couldn't climb out of. Lorraine stood in the doorway, her silk robe shimmering like oil on water. She didn't look like the polished socialite anymore. She looked like a predator who had finally stopped pretending she wasn't hungry. She tapped the heavy iron poker against her open palm, a rhythmic, dull thud, thud, thud that echoed against the bookshelves. Robert didn't move toward me at first. He just leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, watching me with a look of bored disappointment. "Give me the box, Ginny," he said. His voice wasn't the lullaby anymore. It was the cold, flat tone of a man who was calculating the costs of a disposal. "You don't know how to use it. You don't have anywhere to take it. All you're doing is making this harder than it needs to be." I clutched the DVR to my chest, the sharp corners of the metal casing biting into my ribs. I could feel the heat from the electronics, a faint, mechanical pulse that felt like the only truth left in the world. "I'm not giving you anything," I whispered. My voice didn't shake. I was surprised by the steel in it. "Steve told me what you did. He saw her walk out the back door. He saw the transaction." Lorraine's laugh was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the humid air. "Steve Reynolds, the town drunk? You're basing your life on the word of a man who can't see straight past noon?" She stepped forward, the iron bar whistling through the air as she swung it in a small, tight arc. "You're not a hero, Ginny. You're a footnote, a tragic, unstable footnote in a story that's already been written." Robert lunged. He didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed that caught me off guard, his hands reaching for my wrists. I dove to the left, my shoulders slamming into the heavy mahogany desk. Books tumbled from the shelves, their pages fluttering like the wings of dying birds. I felt his fingers brush against my sweater, a frantic, clawing grip. I swung the heavy flashlight, the one Steve had given me, at his head. It connected with a sickening thud against his shoulder. He grunted, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Kill her, Robert!" Lorraine shrieked. She wasn't the brain anymore. She was the fuse. She swung the poker at my legs, the iron bar catching me across the shin. I felt the bone shiver, a white-hot flash of pain that brought me to my knees. I gasped, the DVR slipping from my hands and sliding across the carpet toward the shadows under the desk. Robert was on me in a second, his weight pinning me to the floor, his hands wrapping around my throat. The world started to dim. The blue light from the hallway turned into a swirling dark purple. I looked up at Robert, at the man I had once thought was my sanctuary, and I saw nothing but the fist Steve had warned me about. His eyes were wide, vacant, fixed on the task of extinguishing me. My fingers fumbled on the carpet, searching for anything, a pen, a paperweight, a shard of glass. And then I felt it. The burner phone, the one Steve told me to hit 1 on. I pressed the button with my thumb, just as the air in my lungs turned to fire. I saw Lorraine raising the poker for the final blow, her face twisted into a mask of absolute, terrifying triumph. And then, the back door of the house didn't just open, it exploded. The sound of shattering glass and splintering wood ripped through the house like a thunderclap. Robert's grip loosened for a split second as he turned toward the sound. I bucked, using every ounce of strength I had left to shove him off me. I rolled toward the desk, my fingers finding the cold metal of the DVR. Steve Reynolds burst into the study, his flannel shirt soaked with rain, a heavy iron pry bar in his hand. He didn't look like a drunk, he looked like a storm. He slammed into Robert, the impact sounding like 2 trees colliding. I scrambled back, clutching the box, as Lorraine turned her fury on Steve, the poker whistling through the air. "Go, Ginny!" Robert roared, his voice a tidal wave that filled the room. "The truck! Now!" I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see who won. I ran. I ran through the kitchen, over the broken glass of the back door, and out into the screaming rain. I didn't care about the pain in my leg. I didn't care about the darkness. I ran until I hit the blue metal of the truck, the DVR held against me like a child. I climbed into the driver's seat, the engine already idling, and I realized the silent alarm was gone. The only sound left was the roar of the truth, and it was finally, louder than the lie. I didn't drive to the police station, not the one where Detective Miller worked. I knew that the box of mirrors had deep roots, and a direct approach would only lead to a shallow grave. Steve had given me a name, a woman at the state attorney's office who had been trying to link the powerful man to the money laundering for years. I drove through the night, the DVR buckled into the passenger seat like a silent witness, until the dark woods of the edge of town were replaced by the cold glass towers of the city. We met in a basement office that smelled of old paper and stale peppermint. The state attorney, a woman named Elena Vance, didn't look like she believed in ghosts. She looked like she believed in math. She took the DVR with gloved hands, her face a mask of professional neutrality. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my damp clothes sticking to my skin, my shin throbbing with every heartbeat. I watched her face as she plugged the box into a monitor. The footage didn't just tell the story, it screamed it. There was Robert, his face clear as day, standing over the bleeding man. There was Lorraine, her hand on Robert's shoulder, her mouth moving as she coached him on how to frame me. And then, the most damning part, the moment Robert took my hand, my limp, terrified hand, and pressed my prints onto the smoking barrel. Elena Yance didn't say a word. She just watched it. Then she watched it again. And then she picked up the phone. The reckoning didn't happen in the dark. It happened in the bright, unforgiving light of a Tuesday morning. I sat in the back of the courtroom, my hands folded in my lap, my name, Ginny Morris, finally feeling like it belonged to me again. Robert sat at the defense table, his expensive suit looking a size too large, his face a sickly shade of gray. Lorraine was beside him, her hair still perfect, her back still straight, but her eyes were darting toward the exits. The silent alarm was now the sound of a gavel hitting a wooden block. "The evidence is incontrovertible," the judge said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "Mr. Robert Jones, you are hereby remanded into custody without bail. And Mrs. Lorraine Hale—" The judge paused, looking over her spectacles at the woman who had tried to interior decorate my despair. "Your role in this conspiracy is a stain on this community. You are under arrest for accessory to murder, money laundering, and witness tampering." Karma is not a lightning strike. It is a slow, steady tide that pulls the ground out from under you. As the officers moved in, I watched the architecture of the trap finally collapse. Robert tried to shout, to blame Lorraine, to claim he was a victim. Lorraine didn't say anything. She just looked at me as they clicked the handcuffs onto her thin, manicured wrists. For the first time, she wasn't appraising me. She was fearing me. She saw the woman who had walked back into the ghosts and come out with the fire. Steve Reynolds was waiting for me on the courthouse steps. He looked the same, flannel shirt, cedar-scented, hands in his pockets. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just handed me a set of keys. Not to the Victorian house. Those keys were at the bottom of a river. These were to a small apartment on the other side of the city, a place with windows that actually opened, and a porch where the birds actually sang. "The air is better over there, Ginny," he said. I walked down the steps, the sun warming my face for the first time in an eternity. The house on the edge of town was being seized, the powerful man was being indicted, and the folder that had held my life was now part of a federal case. I realized then that the truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you solid. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was Ginny Morris. And as I stepped into the blue truck with Steve, I knew that the echoes of love and betrayal would always be there. But from now on, my voice would be the loudest thing in the room. And that is the part they don't tell you about being framed. They tell you about the fear. They tell you about the cold steel of the handcuffs and the way the fluorescent lights in an interrogation room seem to eat away at your sanity. But they don't tell you about the quiet, steady war you have to wage within yourself. You don't just fight for your freedom from a cell, you fight for your freedom from the version of yourself they tried to create. Ginny Morris didn't just walk out of a courthouse, she walked out of a cage she had been building for herself since she was a child. She walked back into the house that destroyed her, not because she was weak, not because she was drawn to the trauma, but because she was finally done being a character in someone else's play. She realized that a name is only a label until you decide what it means. Robert and Lorraine are exactly where they belong, trapped in a world of 4 walls and 0 mirrors, left with nothing but the truth they tried so hard to bury. But Ginny is somewhere where the air is clear, where the windows stay open, and where the birds finally sing. Before you leave us tonight, I want you to look at your own life. Is there a 3rd chair in your house? Is there someone whispering that you aren't enough, that you're unstable, or that you're lucky to even be there? If so, let Ginny's story be your silent alarm. Tell us in the comments right now, where are you listening from tonight? And answer this: what is the one thing you are reclaiming for yourself this year? Is it your name, your peace, your truth? We read every single comment. We are a community of survivors, and your voice is the most powerful tool you have. Don't forget to like this video if it touched your soul. Subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayals so you never miss a reckoning. And share this story with that one friend who feels like they're losing their mind. It might just be the key they need to unlock their own door. I'm your narrator, and this has been Echoes of Trust and Betrayals, where the silence is broken, the debt is collected, and the truth always comes back loud. We'll see you in the next one.